Hi guys, this is Max from makeitconscious.com. I hope you're doing well. And today I'm going to talk about the third of the 7 habits of individuation, and that is to practice skillful communication. Now it might be quite a curious place to go to. The last habit 2, was to cultivate wholesome intentions. So what are we doing here in going to speech as our next habit? Well, if you think about it, speech carries on very logically from intention. One of the primary ways in which we interact with the world is through our speech. It's essentially how we communicate thoughts. It's a large part of how we condition the world around us and how the world responds back to us. But also, it's one of the main ways we actually condition our assumptions and beliefs about our existence. Speech is, in a large way, like a printer for the mind. Yes, we speak consciously, and we speak what's on our mind consciously, but a lot of the time what comes out of our mouths, if we're not paying attention, is actually a very representative example of what's going on in our unconscious. So not only is speech and communication more generally a very opportune way to look at what's going on in our mind, it also works the other way as well, and that by managing our communication, we can actually act upon our unconscious mind and move it towards wholeness and individuation. So like with all the habits in these 7, there are 3 key points to keep close as you practice this particular habit. I'm going to go through the 3 of those in summary now because they're very easy to remember. Those 3 points are to monitor your speech with the following questions. Is it true? Is it kind? Maybe I should turn my hands around when I say that. Is it useful? Is it true? Is it kind? Is it useful? And those of you who are especially observant will notice that those 3 points broadly are analogous to the 3 unwholesome roots that I discussed in the previous 2 habits, which are the unseeing, the hatred, and the craving. And if you think about it, those 3 factors of speech actually can be used to address those 3 unwholesome roots. And I'll talk a bit more in detail about how that exactly works. Let's start with the first one. Is it true? Speak the truth, communicate the truth. We're not only talking about verbal speech here, we're talking about all forms of communication. Well, clearly there are many practical problems of not telling the truth. Mark Twain had a great quote. He said, "The great thing about telling the truth is that you don't have to remember anything." I might have paraphrased him slightly there. But of course what he's getting at is that if we don't tell the truth, then it's very discombobulating for the mind. We have to hold on to many things. We have to bear in mind many different parallel realities that aren't congruent with each other. And that, of course, is very burdensome for the mind. It means that we have to work harder. It means we're more likely to make mistakes, of course. But these are all very pragmatic considerations, and they touch on some of the real-world, tangible impacts of why being dishonest might just not be helpful to us. But they don't quite get to the core of why this is. If we are dishonest, if we tell a lie, whether it's an act of omission or a lie of commission, in essence what we're doing here is we're repressing the truth. We're casting the truth into the shadow, effectively, or into our unconscious, so that we don't have to go there, we don't have to look at it. There's a presumption at the heart of this, which is that if only we can poke and cajole the world into being just right, just a certain way, then we'll be okay. Then our feelings will be protected, then we will survive, and then we will belong socially. But of course, because there is this thing known as the unconscious, we can't possibly ever design a system or a view or a set of values that will fully account for everything that exists in our own psyche and that exists in what we call reality. And so by repressing the truth, we are inevitably setting ourselves up for problems down the line, not just for ourselves, but for others as well. So the question to ask here is, what is so scary about the truth? Why aren't we looking at the truth? And maybe that will actually tell us something about what's going on in our own mind. And if we can actually face up to the truth there's going to be a feeling associated with that. And that feeling is something that's been conditioned. It's often not conscious why we feel a certain way. But nonetheless, if we can practice honesty by telling the truth, it will bring that feeling to the surface when we feel the compulsion to be dishonest, if we do, and instead we practice truth, there'll be a feeling that arises. And by addressing that feeling, we can integrate our minds further. So that's the first point. Is it true? Second point, is it kind? Follows a similar theme, because whenever we feel tempted to be unkind, we are essentially repressing our kindness, and we are instead opting for the ego approach, which likes to keep us where we are. It exists for a reason. It exists because in some ways it has helped us survive, it has helped us to belong. But if that mechanism keeps firing, it prevents further growth, and it prevents our higher self from being able to actually take form. So if we're not speaking with kindness, we're essentially speaking through anger, and then we're cultivating anger. And that is not a wholesome activity. That is only going to create more fodder in the unconscious, which will, again, similar to the first point, inevitably come back at some point, whether it's through the actions we take and the results they actually physically produce in the world, or whether it's the way we project our anger onto the world. We might find that we actually encounter angry people more often, or we actually start seeing that in the outer world more because it's actually part of us that we're not conscious of. So that's the second point to bear in mind. That is the question, is it kind? Now the third point to keep close to mind here is it useful? Now this is actually a little bit more intricate than it sounds at first glance, because there's many ways in which communication might not be useful. We might feel compelled to tell someone something, to send them an article that we think they might find interesting, or to impose our views on others even though they weren't receptive to it at that time. And the theme behind all of these is that we really make it about us. When we say something that isn't useful, we are almost invariably coming from a place of impulse, which again is an ego-conditioned reaction. We're saying it because we are trying to address feelings in ourselves, and we're trying to attain our own social belonging, perhaps, our own sense of significance and so on. And we're maybe not looking at those unconscious drivers that are compelling us to do that. And so there's many ways in which we might fall short of this particular point here. And it's a practice, of course. There's no right or wrong, but it's just something to bear in mind if we're interested in moving our minds closer to a more peaceful, joyful state of individuation. So we might say something that's mistimed. It may be true, it may be kind, it may even have kind, loving kindness intentions, but it might not be the right time. And so by speaking at the time that's wrong for the other person, it is necessarily because we're speaking from our own impulse, our own desire to just get something out, get it off our chest. Another way in which you see this in the modern age quite frequently is through what we call spam. So, back in the days of the early internet, the spam was just everywhere. There was no restrictions. There was almost culturally no understanding yet of what was really going on there. But what that was, of course, was marketeers acting from a place of craving. They were just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what would stick. And over time, as we all got a bit wiser, we started to see what was going on here. And as the world evolved and we created more opportunities for us to experiment and discover what was true about ourselves, attention became more and more limited. So there's this concept of the long tail, which is the idea that the number of niches that consumers these days might actually show an interest in is just ever expanding. And there's a broad, relatively small number of interests that are quite popular, like music and film and so on, really generic, broad interests. But then all the way down the long tail, there's all these interests like equestrian Tai Chi and bonsai tree pruning. And it's going to be hard for me to make up others, but there are just billions of different niches out there. Individuation is a niche. Theravada Buddhism is a niche, Jung is a niche. And so as people learn to discover more about themselves and what it is they need to do for their particular mind at this particular time, their focus becomes more aligned to their particular niche, and their attention is limited. And so if we are to just impose what's right for us on others at that moment, well, there's two mistakes we're making there. We are seeing the world purely through the lens of our own sensing functions, whether that is, we might have a preference for sensing or a preference for intuition, whatever it is. And the second mistake we make there is that we are also deciding for them through the lens of our own judging functions. So, we might be someone who values community harmony above other things, perhaps, or we might value our own internal logic, and yet, of course, other people don't necessarily use the same set of tools that we use to make decisions. So for us to just impose those upon other people is a product of not really making the unconscious conscious. We're coming at it purely from our own ego, i.e. our own sense of I and self. So that was the third key point to bear in mind, which is my communication useful? And the reason this habit is called skillful communication as opposed to skillful speech, because those of you who are familiar with Buddhism might have come across the teaching of right speech. But of course, there's so much more to communication than just verbal speech, not least in the modern age when we have things like email and SMS, WhatsApp, and so on. This is a particularly tricky form of communication because there is so much left to the imagination. In other words, there's so much that's not explicit, and there's a much greater capacity for our own perceptions, projections, our unconscious to fill in the gaps, which is precisely what the mind does and is exactly how the mind works. And so we might need to be extra careful when we're communicating in text form to abide by these three key points of: is it true, is it kind, is it useful? At the same time, there's a flip side, which is that when we're typing out a message, we actually get more time to review it. And as many of you will have no doubt discovered, it can be extremely effective sometimes to write an email or write a text message and then leave it for half an hour, or sleep on it and then come back to it the next day. And you will see it in an entirely different light because your mind's in a completely different state. And so, if that isn't a testament to the workings of the conscious and the unconscious mind and the interplay between them, I don't know what is. So that's actually quite a useful technique as well. There's no rush, there's no need to impulsively send things out. And the other reason it's called skillful communication and not skillful speech is because there is a lot more to communication than merely our words. There is our tone, the way we say things. There is our body language. And there's also subtleties like hinting and implying and so on. And now there is one cheeky little way that our ego sometimes likes to get around this, which is to tell us that, oh, well, I didn't lie. I didn't tell an overt lie, so it's okay, right? But of course, if we are hinting or implying or in any other way suggesting something that we wouldn't say directly, then insofar as individuation is concerned, it's pretty similar. Like, the intention there is to create a model of reality in another being, and we're doing so probably because we think it's going to benefit ourselves in some way. Of course, whenever we're trying to benefit ourselves at the expense of someone else, that is unwholesome. That is conducive to separation. It's not conducive to an integrated mind, because an integrated mind doesn't need other people to behave in a certain way permanently. It understands that the world is merely a projection of the unconscious. And so, like all of these habits, skillful communication works off the principle that it helps to make the unconscious conscious. And by bearing these points in mind, every time we find ourselves maybe deviating from that slightly, and it will happen because this is a practice, and it's a life practice, there's no end point to it really, then it's going to prompt us to stop. The first thing is to stop and notice. The second thing that's going to happen is we're going to become conscious of what feelings are arising in that moment. And in doing so, we can face up to those, make them conscious, and then use our conscious mind to actually make a more wholesome decision. And that way, whatever conditioning was there that was compelling us to speak in a certain way or type in a certain way, that starts to melt away. And that is where true freedom is born. That is how the higher self is realized and the individuation process is achieved. So I hope that was all useful, guys. I'll leave that there and I'll speak to you next time.